There is a village in southern Lebanon called Mansouri, a small collection of homes and shops in the rolling hills about 6 miles from the Israeli border, the kind of place where families have lived for generations, where children grew up knowing every neighbor, where a mosque stood at the center of the community the way mosques stand at the center of communities across this entire region. Center of Mansouri now lies in ruins, a row of single-story shops blown out, goods scattered on the ground, glass shattered along the sidewalk, homes and buildings crumpled into themselves, unrecognizable, the mosque blackened and burned, the minaret split in two, a Lebanese civil defense emergency vehicle crushed next to the rubble, its windshield smashed. This is what a ceasefire looks like in southern Lebanon. There are no Israeli soldiers fighting in Mansouri right now. The ceasefire is technically in place, but the destruction of Mansouri did not stop when the ceasefire started, because the destruction of Mansouri was not the consequence of fighting. It was the consequence of a deliberate policy, carried out methodically, documented publicly by the Israeli military itself, in videos posted to social media showing entire neighborhoods erupting into clouds of dust at the push of a detonator. Israel has been very public about the controlled demolitions its military has been carrying out in many of the 55 Lebanese towns and villages it now occupies in the south, publishing videos showing entire neighborhoods eviscerated in seconds, the concrete homes and shops erupting into clouds of dust. And Israel's defense minister said something this week that I have not been able to stop thinking about. Said, the fate of southern Lebanon will be the same as that of Gaza, the same as Gaza. I want to examine what that statement actually means and why the world's response to it tells us something important about the moment we are living through before we continue for things, and I want to explain why each one matters. Subscribe to Respect B, because what I am about to tell you about what is happening in southern Lebanon, about what the satellite images show, about what the UN human rights experts are saying, and about what it means when a defense minister openly declares his intention to replicate Gaza. Give it a like and leave a comment. Tell me where in the world you are watching from, your city, your country. Every location in these comments is proof that this conversation is reaching the places the cameras have largely abandoned. Now let us examine what is actually happening in southern Lebanon and why it matters for everything that comes after this war. I want to begin with the satellite data because it provides an objectivity that ground reports and official statements cannot. Corey Scher is a postdoctoral researcher at the Conflict Ecology Laboratory at Oregon State University, a scientist who has spent months studying satellite imagery of both Gaza and southern Lebanon, comparing the two conflict zones, measuring the destruction quantitatively rather than describing it qualitatively. Says a similarity is starting to emerge between the two. Previously damaged areas in Lebanon are now being completely leveled. Previously damaged areas being completely leveled. That phrase carries a specific meaning in the language of conflict analysis. It means that structures which were hit in earlier strikes, structures that were damaged but still standing, are now being systematically brought down, not by combat, not by active fighting, but by deliberate demolition of what remains. Lebanese officials estimate some 62,000 homes have been damaged or destroyed since the beginning of March alone. 62,000 homes in less than 2 months, and there is no independent access to confirm or refute what is happening. There is no access to the area in southern Lebanon now occupied by Israel, not for residents, not for journalists. What we know comes from satellite imagery, from the accounts of displaced Lebanese who managed to get messages out, and from the Israeli military's own videos, which Israel has published not as evidence against itself but as proof of effectiveness, as demonstrations of military capability, as content for social media. I find that last detail extraordinary. A military that documents its own demolition of civilian villages and publishes the footage because it considers the footage evidence of success is a military that has made a specific calculation about what the international community will and will not respond to. That calculation appears to be correct because the international community is watching. Again, the villages are still coming down. Let me now examine the statement that Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz made this week because I think it deserves more scrutiny than it has received. Said, speaking to Israeli troops in southern Lebanon, the fate of southern Lebanon will be the same as that of Gaza and earlier. We are removing the threat just as we did In Gaza, referring to neighborhoods completely leveled by the Israeli military there, I want to be precise about what the same as Gaza means as a factual description, not as a rhetorical devotee. Gaza, as of today, has had the majority of its buildings damaged or destroyed according to United Nations assessments more than 2 years of war have produced a level of destruction that independent researchers have described as one of the most intensive demolition campaigns in the history of modern warfare. Bodies still buried under rubble, infrastructure essentially non-existent, a population that has been displaced multiple times with nowhere to return to that still exist. When an Israeli defense minister says the fate of southern Lebanon will be the same as Gaza, he is describing a specific and documented outcome as the intended result of his military's operation. She is not speaking metaphorically. He is not describing an unfortunate consequence. She is stating a Policia group of human rights experts appointed by the United Nations wrote, "We are witnessing the continuing utmost contempt for the international legal order, for diplomacy, and above all for the lives of civilians and the environment in Lebanon," noting that the issuance of what they called blanket evacuation orders and destruction of housing was consistent with Israel's actions in Gaza. The UN's own human rights experts are drawing the parallel explicitly not as a political argument but as a legal characterization, noting that blanket evacuation orders followed by total demolition of civilian areas is a pattern with specific implications under international humanitarian law. Israel says it is destroying Hezbollah infrastructure and that the goal is to create a buffer zone along its border to keep Hezbollah from attacking its northern residents, but those demolitions have also significantly destroyed civilian infrastructure, which is considered to be a violation of international law and a potential war crime. That phrase, used by NPR, by Human Rights Watch, by the United Nations experts, is appearing with increasing frequency in the coverage of southern Lebanon, in the same way it appeared with increasing frequency in the coverage of Gaza, and I want to examine what the word potential is doing in that sentence. It is doing two things simultaneously. It is honest because the legal determination requires a formal process that has not yet concluded, and it is also serving as a buffer, a word that allows institutions to describe what the evidence shows while stopping short of the direct statement that the evidence supports. Have spent for decades in journalism and analysis know what potential means when it is used 50 times about the same pattern of conduct. It means the conduct meets the factual description of the thing it is potential evidence of. I want to introduce you to two people whose stories appear in the ground reporting from southern Lebanon, because I think the human dimension of this story has been almost entirely absent from the coverage of the Iran war's diplomatic developments. First is Abed Amr, 35 years old, an emergency responder from Mansouri who returned on the first day of the temporary ceasefire to find the central part of his village destroyed, shops blown out, homes unrecognizable, the mosque split, but whose house on the hill was only lightly damaged, who has been living there since, watching from his hill as the demolitions continue in the valley below, unable to stop them. Unable to leave because where would he go? Unable to understand by what logic his hill survives while his neighbors' homes are systematically erased. The second is Zainab Mahdi, a Lebanese woman who has been hearing from peacekeepers that her house is completely gone now, along with most of her village. She says, "But I'm also feeling a lot of fear. What if I can't return in my lifetime? What if I cannot return in my lifetime?" That sentence comes from a woman talking about a village in Lebanon, a country that is not at war with Israel in any formal sense, a country that signed a ceasefire, a country whose president has been on the phone with world leaders pleading for protection of Lebanese civilians. The last time Israel occupied part of southern Lebanon, it did so for nearly 2 decades now. Israel has said it is prepared to stay for months or even years. Want you to hold that alongside the ceasefire that Trump announced and extended and described as a diplomatic achievement. The ceasefire is real in the sense that major military exchanges have paused, but for Zainab Mahdi, for Abed Amr, for the more than 1 million Lebanese who have been displaced since March, the ceasefire has not stopped the demolitions, has not reopened access to their villages, has not returned their homes to the state they were in before. The ceasefire that the diplomats are extending and discussing and negotiating around exists in a different reality from the ceasefire that the people of southern Lebanon are living in. I think that gap between the diplomatic ceasefire and the lived ceasefire is one of the most important and least examined aspects of this entire conflict. The obvious question, the question that anyone watching this story must be asking, is why the international community is not stopping what is happening in southern Lebanon is a legitimate question, and I want to give it a serious answer rather than a rhetorical one. The structural answer involves three elements that intersect in ways that produce the outcome we are observing. First, the United States is Israel's primary security guarantor and its most important arms supplier, and the United States is itself at war with Iran, and Iran is the primary backer of Hezbollah, which is Israel's stated target in Lebanon. This creates a situation in which the government most capable of constraining Israeli military conduct in Lebanon has a direct interest in Hezbollah's degradation, and therefore a direct interest in not constraining that conduct to forcefully second the international legal mechanisms that might otherwise produce consequences for the kind of conduct being documented in southern Lebanon. The International Criminal Court, the UN Security Council face structural barriers that prevent them from operating effectively. In this case, the ICC has issued arrest warrants for Israeli officials, but the enforcement mechanism depends on member states, and the Security Council is paralyzed by the veto power of the United States, which will not support any resolution that places binding obligations on Israel. Third, the media environment of this war has been dominated by the Iran-US conflict's economic dimensions: oil prices, the Strait of Hormuz, ceasefire negotiations, missile stockpiles, which are the dimensions that most directly affect Western audiences, while the Lebanon story, which most directly affects Lebanese civilians, has been consistently subordinated to the diplomatic and economic narrative. These three elements, American strategic interest, legal paralysis, and media subordination, combine to produce a situation in which 55 Lebanese towns and villages can be systematically demolished during a ceasefire. The UN's own human rights experts can describe it as utmost contempt for the international legal order, and the world's response is to continue the ceasefire negotiations in Islamabad and Oman as though what is happening in Mansouri is a separate story. It is not a separate story, it is the same story, told from a different angle, the angle that the cameras are not pointing at. Mansouri, southern Lebanon, a village 6 miles from the Israeli border, where a 35-year-old emergency responder named Abed Amr sits on a hill and watches the demolitions continue. In the valley below, a village where a mosque stood at the center of the community, the minaret split in two now, the building blackened and burned. Village that is, according to Israel's own defense minister, experiencing the fate that Israel intends for all of southern Lebanon, the same fate as Gaza. I have spent for decades watching how governments conduct themselves in war and how the international community responds or fails to respond to the conduct it witnesses, and I want to say something directly about what I observe in southern Lebanon today. The villages being demolished are not military installations, they are not weapons depots, they are the places where ordinary people lived ordinary lives before this war began, and they are being erased during a ceasefire, with the Israeli military publishing the videos of their erasure on social media as proof of effectiveness. The UN human rights experts called it utmost contempt for the international legal order. Find that phrase inadequate to the scale of what the satellite images show, but I understand why it was chosen. Institutions speak in the language that institutions speak, and the language of international law moves more slowly than the detonators. In southern Lebanon, what I know from 4 decades of watching is this: the places that are erased in wartime do not rebuild themselves in peacetime. The people who ask, what if I cannot return in my lifetime, are sometimes right, and the decisions made in the next few weeks about the diplomatic resolution of this war will determine whether Zainab Mahdi returns to her village, or whether her village, like so many in Gaza before it, exists only in the memory of the people who once called it home. That is not an abstract question, it is the question that should be at the center of every ceasefire negotiation, and it is, from what I can observe, at the periphery of every ceasefire negotiation.